Métis Nation. My name is Doris Wolfe. I'm a faculty member in the English department. I'm the current director of the Center for Research in Young People's Texts and Cultures. We're one of the co-sponsors of the event tonight. The other sponsor is the Department of English, so I want to thank them for this event. We have a wonderful night ahead of us. Of course, the highlight is Perry's talk that he'll start shortly. I also wanted to mention that we will have a reception after the lecture. It's catered by Stella's, and so we should have some wonderful food, wonderful conversation afterwards. So I do hope that everyone can stay and have a good time. So thank you to Stella's. I also wanted to thank Larissa Wodka, who's not here tonight, but she did all the pre-organizing of the event. I want to thank Emma Watman, who's here, is helping me tonight as well. In a minute, I'm going to turn over the floor to Dr. Mavis Reimer, who has requested the pleasure of introducing Perry tonight. Mavis and Perry go back a long way. They've worked on many projects together, including The Pleasures of Children's Literature, which they co-authored, that textbook that so many of us use in our classrooms when we teach children's literature. Mavis is an English professor here as well. She established the Center for Research in Young People's Texts and Cultures. She was its first director, and she's currently the Dean of Graduate Studies. So I'll turn it over to Mavis. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Doris. So introducers usually start by saying this is a person to whom, for whom no introduction is necessary, and so on. And I actually was going to start like that, and then I realized that sometimes I think we actually do need to be introduced to people we all know, because we know them in one way, but we, in a sense, often don't know their full profile. And I can't do that, but I certainly can at least take a little bit of time to remind you about who Perry Nodelman is and some of what his work is. So Perry joined the faculty of the English department of the University of Winnipeg on the 1st of September 1968, fresh from earning his PhD at Yale University, where he had studied under some of the new critics that still populated that department at that time, and certainly their legacy, I think, was very strong in the department. If you know Perry's work, you can see that heritage, I think. He remained a member of the English department until he retired 37 years later on the 1st of September 2005. So in most of the 37 years that he was here, he taught a full load of undergraduate courses. And a full load is what we would now call a 3-3 load. And some of his courses were very popular. Many of his courses were very popular. In fact, I think one of the first courses I ever taught here, I was asked to teach a second section to one of Perry's that had gone so far over any capacity for any of the rooms on this campus that they decided to put in a second section. So that's actually how I wiggled my way in here. But in any case, with his courses being so popular, at one time his introductory children's lit classes had well over 100 students in them. And so I did some quick arithmetic on the back of an envelope this afternoon, and it seems to me that even by the most conservative estimates, it's probably likely that Perry has taught more than 8,000 U of W students during his time here. So that's a lot of people that he has touched. He carried this load of teaching while at the same time building a stellar international career as a theorist and researcher in his discipline of children's literature. Perry's probably best known for his influential argument, which he first developed in a 1985 article in Studies in the Literary Imagination, that children's literature can usefully be regarded as a genre in its own right. That argument is still very much associated with Perry worldwide. It was extended in the textbook The Pleasures of Children's Literature, the first edition of which he authored on his own and was published in 1992. I didn't join him as co-author until the third edition in 2003. So his theory of the genre can be summarized, I think, quite neatly by his description of the generic story of children's literature as a home-away-home story. And that description very nicely and neatly conflates his contention that both this kind of literature is characterized by circular plots, typically domestic settings, and binary thematic structures organized around home and away. In his most recent monograph, The Hidden Adult, which was published by Johns Hopkins University Press in 2008, he returned to a proposition from this early work, and that proposition was that the characteristics of children's literature emerge from enduring, ambivalent adult ideas about childhood, and he explored the way in which this literature invites the child readers it addresses to share this ambivalence, and in Perry's words, to occupy or enact a childlike view, while also to recognize and repress the adult knowledge sublimated in the shadow texts of children's literature. So I'm sure as my colleagues who are here in the field of young people's texts and cultures will confirm, this argument is being quoted everywhere. We hear it everywhere. At all the international conferences we go to, scholars around the world are really contesting this argument, testing it, extending it, exploring its implications, and so on. So Perry has also made significant contributions to the field through his work as an editor. He edited the Children's Literature Association Quarterly, one of the leading American journals in the field in the 1980s, between 1980 and 88. In 2004, shortly before he retired from teaching, he brought the Journal of Canadian Children's Literature to the U of W, and he edited it here until 2008. The journal, of course, remains on the campus, although now under the title Jeunesse, Young People Texts Cultures. And in 1993, as if he didn't have enough to do, he began a parallel career as a writer of young people's books. So the award, which is the occasion for our honoring him tonight, recognizes yet another aspect of Perry's research achievements, and that is his work on picture books. So his, in 1988, his first monograph, Words About Pictures, The Narrative Art of Picture Books, was published by the University of Georgia Press, and it has never been out of print since that time, which is a pretty singular accomplishment for an academic book. It continues to be widely referenced as a key text in the field, and in fact Naomi Hamer and myself are joining with Perry to edit a collection that's going to be called Beyond Words About Pictures, I think. That includes work by Perry as well. The International Brothers Grimm Award, that is the occasion for our being here tonight, is presented to a scholar who has produced outstanding research in the field of children's literature. It's presented by the International Institute for Children's Literature in Osaka, Japan, and the committee that decided on the award pointed in particular to his continuing influence in the field of study of picture books as at least one of the bases for the award. So I know Perry will be leaving shortly. Billy tells me next week, Wednesday. I think she's going with him, so they will be leaving shortly for a tour of Japanese universities and institutes. And the talk he's giving tonight, I understand, is one of the talks, or at least a version of one of the talks he'll be delivering there. So please join me in welcoming Perry Nodelman, alumnus and professor emeritus at the University of Winnipeg.
Okay. I'll just preface this by saying, well, first of all, thank you, Mavis. The people at the Institute in Japan made it clear to me that I was supposed to talk for at least an hour because they said no one ever has any good questions to ask. So this is much of the talk I'm going to give in Japan, but I don't think it's quite the whole thing. Okay. I was trained as a scholar of written literature. I wrote my doctoral dissertation on the work of the 19th century English poet Tennyson, getting an in-depth experience of what it means to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. Maybe not the finding part, but the rest. Yet my best-known scholarly work is a book about a visual form of art, Words About Pictures, the Narrative Art of Children's Picture Books, first published in 1988. Why did I choose to write a book on a subject I was not trained in? I did it exactly for that reason, because I realized I knew nothing about something that it had become important for me to know something about. Despite my training in Tennyson, my department chair, Walter Swayze, whom I was also fortunate enough to have been taught by as an undergraduate at United College, had assigned me to teach a children's literature course in which, of course, I had to talk about picture books. They were too important a part of children's literature to leave out. But I soon realized that I simply didn't know what to say about them. I enjoyed looking at picture books and reading them, but what made them so much fun? I had no idea. Nor was anything I could find in published discussions of picture books all that much help. Most of what I read was focused on sharing picture books with children without much consideration of what the books themselves were or how they worked. Some writers seem to assume that the pictures in these books were just there as gaudy objects to attract flighty young people, young minds to the texts and their significant educational content. Some thought the pictures were there primarily to help children decode the words, on what I believe to be the wrong assumption that pictures are more automatically understood than printed text. For pictures surely make most of their sense in the context of cultural understandings of what and how visual objects take on meanings. And some approached the illustrations as if they were exactly like the kinds of works of art that hang in a gallery, and discussed their aesthetic qualities and their usefulness in training children to look at and appreciate art without much reference to the text they accompany. Focused on one of the two media found in picture books, pictures and text, these approaches either ignored the other or took it for granted. What I wanted to know was something different, something that took both the media in these books into account. It had to do with what happened when words accompanied pictures and pictures accompanied words, how they affected each other, and what resulted from those effects. My focus is revealed in the title of the first conference paper I wrote about picture books, How Picture Books Work. In trying to figure out how picture books work, I came upon a lot of clues in a wide range of different places. In discussions of the psychology of pictorial perception, in descriptions of how paintings and photographs and films communicate, in theories of illustration and histories of illustrated books, and especially in analyses of the semiotics or meaningful codes of visual imagery. None of these sources specifically discuss children's picture books. My task was to apply these existing ideas to this different context. And the view of how picture books communicate I developed was little more than a companion of ideas from my sources. What I borrowed from these discussions of movies and paintings and photographs was a catalog of ways in which visual images convey information about the subjects they depict. Consider, for instance, the first page of John Birmingham's Mr. Gumpy's Outing. As the text says, this is Mr. Gumpy. Oh, this is Mr. Gumpy. The picture shows us who Mr. Gumpy is, that is what he looks like. It also supports the positioning of Mr. Gumpy in the center of the picture by telling us that this male figure is what the picture is centrally about. That it's not, for instance, a picture of a house intended to help a real estate agent make a sale, or a page from a clothing catalog advertising rubber boots, or a depiction of what cumulus clouds look like. But as well as directing attention to Mr. Gumpy, it also says a lot more about him. It tells us that he's a grown-up male human being, important information, for in a picture book, Mr. Gumpy might equally well be a bear or an abstract alien like Roger Hargrave's Mr. Crumpy. It happened. Slides? Oh. Sorry about that. The picture shows us also, it tells us that he dresses practically in a sensible, in high boots and a sensible hat that suggest he might be going out to work in his garden or perhaps for a walk in the country. It tells us that he seems to be a happy fellow, greeting readers of the book with a smile, or perhaps, as his pose suggests, he's having his photograph taken and is smiling for the camera. One way or the other, he appears to be unthreatening. If we assume, as the picture seems to be inviting us to do by showing him in front of it, that he's standing in front of his own house, then we can guess that he's a member of the middle class, able to afford this kind of house, that he lives in the countryside or a pleasant suburb, probably from the appearance of the house somewhere in England or elsewhere in Europe. The house appears to be in the Georgian style of the 18th century, which might suggest that Mr. Gumpy feels comfortable with old-fashioned things and has chosen the countryside to avoid the discourse of modern urban life. The picture also shows some gardens in bloom and a well-mowed lawn, suggesting he's a tidy man who cares for keeping up appearances even though he does not sport the latest fashions. Beyond all these suggestive details, the picture also conveys attitudes towards Mr. Gumpy by means of its style. The gentle impressionistic pencil drawing with its lightly drawn cross-hatchings and pastel colors implies that its subject is equally gentle, equally harmless. Mr. Gumpy is unlikely to be a kidnapper or an axe murderer. Unlike figures of people in Impressionist paintings by Monet or Sargent, he's not merely an equally placid part of the landscape. His smile seems a little devilish, and the cartoon-like ways in which his figure is drawn suggest the possibility of a greater action and possible comedy to follow, as indeed in this book it does. This picture reveals yet other techniques that convey further information about the events. The composition of the picture implies an explosion of the various characters outwards from the center of the boat. As they head off in all directions, the characters' uncontrolled arms and legs create a chaotic pattern that expresses the anarchic energy of their tumble. Furthermore, all are depicted at the same carefully chosen moment, after the boat has tipped, but before they've been immersed in the water, thus implying what came before and what is to follow in a suspenseful way that implies the passing of time. And details like the girl's hair rising straight above her head tell us how rapidly these characters are moving and how quickly all this happens. The picture captures one moment in a way that allows us to explore its details for a long time, and thus to learn more about what happens to each of the characters and how they all respond to it. And while these are unfortunate events, the bright sun above the characters and the happy pastel colors imply that there's something to laugh about rather than being a tragedy. Imagine, for instance, that an illustrator chose to illustrate the text "Into the water they fell" in a style something like this one. Or this one. Or this one. Different styles convey different attitudes toward a subject that help to determine how we're being invited to respond to them, and therefore what they might mean to us. What I just described is a small sample of the ways in which the pictures in picture books convey meanings that I described in Words About Pictures. In it, I looked at the implied meanings of the formatted books and their design, their size and shape, and the qualities of the paper and ink they use, the overall effects of predominant colors and shapes and other aspects of style, the implications of lines, shapes and colors, codes, symbols, and gestures, how the size and placement of objects in pictures gives them different amount of weight, and how that creates tensions between them that express the relationships of characters and other objects, the depiction of action and time, and various aspects of the relationship of words and pictures. Together, all these aspects of pictures and of words and pictures together combine to make the pictures in picture books a rich source of information about the stories they're helping to tell. After Words About Pictures was published, I was pleased to discover that others found my compendium of ways to think about picture books helpful. In fact, Words About Pictures has never been out of print, as Mavis said, and a symposium held here at the University of Winnipeg in 2013 in celebration of its 25th anniversary attracted a number of international scholars in what has become a significant field of study. Paradoxically, however, what those scholars talked about was not always picture books. In 1988, I could explore the picture book form with a fairly clear sense about just what a picture book was. In the 100 or so years since illustrators and writers like Randolph Caldecott and Beatrix Potter had produced the first books we might still recognize as being children's picture books, publishers and purchasers had developed a set of characteristics that defined the form and made it instantly recognizable. Conventions about the size and shape and length of the books and about the relationships between their pictures and their text that tell us that a book belongs on a shelf of picture books and that most of us probably still take for granted. That's my shelf of picture books at home. Just as picture books themselves expanded beyond the traditional preschool audience of the 1980s, says Roger Sutton, so have illustrators gone on to stretch the very definition of the form. While the selection of the 500-some page invention of Hugo Cabret for the 2008 Caldecott Medal, which is for Best Illustrated Children's Book, will probably always be a controversial choice, there's no doubt that it, along with the entrance of comics and graphic novels into the realm of children's book respectability, makes us all think more broadly about what we mean by a picture book. Hugo Cabret is probably more what people often call a graphic novel. A graphic novel being a book that tells a story or conveys information by means of the kinds of panels found in a comic book, but usually longer than the conventional North American comic book of 32 pages, and bound with a more durable cover, like a novel. There are increasing numbers of graphic novels published specifically for audiences of children all the time now. Books like C. Spell's El Defo, Raina Telgemeyer's Smile, and Marika and Gillian Tamaki's Skim. And young readers are also a significant part of the audience of other graphic novels that appear to cut across age categories. Nor are graphic novels the only new development since 1988. There are also a variety of forms that did not even exist then. Things like e-book versions of picture books and picture book apps. There are also still, of course, many conventional picture books that might be illuminated by the approach I took in 1988. But there are also many other texts for young readers containing both verbal and visual components that my old theories cannot even begin to account for. My plan today is to take a look back at what I said in Words About Pictures in order to consider how I might need to expand or transform my old ideas to include these newer developments. A first glance back, however, reveals a gap I might well have filled back in the 80s, if it had occurred to me to do so. But I have to admit it didn't. Words About Pictures has nothing to say about one of the kinds of text Sutton refers to, comics. Thinking back on it now, I have to admit that the idea that comics might need to be included in my consideration of visual verbal text for young people did not even occur to me. I did mention comics form here and there in Words About Pictures, although only when the analysis of a picture book like Maurice Sendak's In the Night Kitchen led me to reference the use of comic conventions, like a series of panels or speech balloons. I suspect my neglect of comics happened because of what Sutton calls children's book respectability. The extent to which picture books possessed and comics did not possess an academic version of what the theorist Pierre Bourdieu identifies as cultural capital. The ability of some texts to provide academic power to those who choose to engage in critical discussions of them. In North America and Europe in the 80s, a lot of people who worked with children's literature looked down on comics. Librarians rarely purchased them for their collections. Teachers wouldn't count them as part of their students' fulfillment of reading goals. And they were in any case very cheap to buy and very disposable. Stapled pamphlets printed on cheap newsprint that did not seem much like serious literature at all. I think I quite unconsciously accepted the view that comics were not literature. So much so that I couldn't even imagine thinking about how they might relate to the ideas about visual narratives for children that I was exploring in my book. Nor was I alone in that lapse. As Charles Hatfield has suggested, until recently, the sustained aesthetic study of comics alongside, rather than in contradistinction to, children's books has been neglected. This represents not simply a blind spot in the field of children's literature studies, but arguably one of those constitutive absences around which the field has built itself. A convenient other, one whose very otherness makes it useful as a means of distinguishing children's literature from the general swirl of hyper-commercial children's culture. Nowadays, though, serious children's literature scholars tend to work with a cultural studies orientation, with a conviction that all the texts and objects produced by a culture are equally expressive of that culture's values and therefore equally worthy of critical analysis. Scholarship of this sort tends to downplay efforts to separate so-called serious literature or good literature from supposedly less worthwhile or important texts. The goal is less to determine what makes for a good book for young readers than to determine how texts are inviting young readers to understand themselves and their world. As a result, a wide range of products of commercial culture, including, for instance, widely read English translations of Japanese manga, are the subject of critical study. And so comics generally are decidedly less of an other. If I were writing Words About Pictures now, I would happily work to include them. And indeed, I've recently been doing some writing about what the indigenous Canadian artist Michael Yagalanis identifies as a Haida manga. Read this book, it looks like this, into relation to how this form of comic storytelling differs from what happens in picture books, how a series of panels operates differently than a series of full-page pictures. I've been particularly interested in the different rhythms these conventions create, how looking at many panels on one page and the process of looking at one panel and how the words in it connect to its picture, and then looking at the next panel with an awareness of how it does or does not connect to the previous one, And those now previous to that one, all the while being aware of all the separate but connected panels visible at once, is a different experience from the process of looking at just one or two pictures on each double-page spread in a picture book. In ignoring comics and focusing on picture books, I now realize I was also ignoring the evidence of my own childhood experience. As the child of a soldier in the Canadian Army, growing up on a military base in the 1940s and 1950s, most of my own childhood reading consisted of comics. I read newspaper strips like Dick Tracy and Blondie, and comic books about characters as diverse as Superman and Little Lulu. But very few picture books. They simply were not available to me. There were certainly no picture books in any of the traditionally austere classrooms at my school, which, like most schools in North America back then, had no library. The only books we had access to were textbooks, first the Dick and Jane series, and then unillustrated anthologies of short stories and poems. I can still recite most of Shelley's Ozymandias from that experience. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, "Too vast and trunkless." When I was a teenager, my parents cared enough about literacy and finally had enough money to buy my younger brothers and me the Children's Hour, a 16-volume hardbound set of stories for children distributed by Simpson Sears. It included some picture book text, each accompanied by just one or two of their original pictures. So it would be like this. This is the story of Babar in the Children's Hour. Most of the text, one picture. And then the book version, which had pages like this. The tiny community library I visited, a volunteer organization with a collection consisting exclusively of discards from its patrons, had nothing much more in the way of picture books than one or two well-used Dr. Seuss books. Cheaper picture books, like the Little Golden Books, were beginning to exist in my younger years, and to be found in places like 5 and dime department stores. They were, however, a new phenomenon and not one that had yet reached the rural part of Canada I lived in. My family owned no such books. I do remember hearing some picture book stories told over the radio. Stories like Frank Tashlin's The Bear That Wasn't. This is actually a picture of a copy of this book I found a few years back in a bookstore and was astonished to realize it was a picture book. It was a story I knew from hearing it on the radio. So I didn't see the pictures meant to accompany it until I grew up. Started to teach children's literature and finally came upon it in book form. In my childhood, these books were picture books without pictures. As I think back on all this now, I realize how very much of my childhood lack of contact with picture books must have had to do with money, or the lack of it, and therefore with social class. And so how very class-oriented the experience of picture books was back then. You had to have a certain income and live a certain lifestyle to even have access to them. The simple fact is, picture books, often printed in 4 colors on the relatively costly paper that can handle that kind of ink, were then, and still often are now, expensive. In my childhood, not many less affluent families or libraries or schools could afford them. My parents certainly could not afford them. Perhaps for that reason, there were no educational philosophies that mandated the classroom use of picture books, or supported the idea that children benefited from access to a variety of them. And as a result, there appears to have been no effort to put picture books into the hands of children like me. We were quite simply not upscale enough to be the picture book market. Had I realized that in 1988, it would have been something well worth talking about in Words About Pictures. As Natalie Optebeck suggests, furthermore, the audience for picture books not only master visual verbal by toying with a picture book, but also values that book as a consecrated consumer good. In their relative sumptuousness, picture books have traditionally defined their readers as deserving of such luxury, as at least middle class, and therefore most likely in North America and Europe, white consumers. In America, the UK, and elsewhere, when I was young, most picture books acknowledged an audience consisting of fairly well-off middle-class parents and children by revolving around characters who lived fairly well-off middle-class lives. often strangely in idyllic rural environments, unlike those of many of their more upscale urban readers. But characters in books by authors like Margaret Wise Brown or Robert McCloskey seem to live primarily in happy, prosperous families. Even the house in Virginia Lee Burton's The Little House represented a normative and fairly upper middle class lifestyle before and after it descended into less cozy and therefore undesirable urban despair. So it's in this beautiful suburban setting, and then it's here, but then it comes back here at the end. Not only were the children in these books not people of color, they were clearly also not like me, Jewish, not different in any way from an assumed norm. Publishers clearly had no reason and felt no pressure to make their books more immediately relevant to children like me. We weren't their market. When I first came upon picture books in my later life, I admired them most exactly because the world they took for granted seemed so different from my own experiences, so gloriously exotic. While there were no children in my life at that time, I owned some books by Marie Sendak even before my department chair assigned me a children's literature course. This one and this one. Indeed, I suspect it was the chair's knowledge of that secret vice of mine that gave him what seemed to me a high-minded young intellectual with an appropriate interest in classics of poetry and cutting-edge adult literature, the bizarre belief that something as silly and as simple as children's literature might suit me. I purchased these Sendak books exactly because of their respectability. For all their whimsy, to me they looked like and read like sophisticated art. There was something classy about them, something redolent of the New Yorker magazine of sophistication and martinis and Manhattan. And I show you the connection. This is a New Yorker cover with a drawing by William Steig, a very well-known children's picture book illustrator. He did a book like this. And this is a New Yorker cover by Sendak. Okay. In any case, this world of martinis in Manhattan is something decidedly unlike my own childhood. I'll save that for a minute. As these pictures show, my perception of the connection between picture fiction and New York sophistication was no accident in any case. When a few years later I decided to focus my research on picture books, I was a veteran of a number of children's literature courses with a quite significant knowledge of many picture books, many of them cheap reprints or Disney tie-ins or biblical Sunday school tales, like this one or this one. The less noteworthy products of a burgeoning picture book industry that were anything but classy and that my students often brought to class as well-born favorites of their children or from their own childhoods. Nevertheless, as I wrote words about pictures, I obviously still thought of the picture book as inherently a form of sophisticated art. Sophisticated enough, certainly, to exclude comics, which I was certain were not art. Or at least not the kind of art that a serious, respectable scholar like me might care to write an academic book about. Furthermore, that serious, respectable scholar had acquired a family of young children, and he was perfectly aware that their experience of picture books was quite different from his own childhood one. For them, picture books were not special, not alien to their experience at all, anything but. I dug up a bunch of old photos to show pictures in the life of the young Nodelmans. Starting at a very early age. And if you look at this picture of the father reading the children some stories, you'll see that on the bulletin board behind there's a newspaper clipping, which is the picture of the father reading the child. Not only was my children's father a picture book scholar with a large stack of research materials his fortunate children had access to, but they were born into a time when changing ideas about literacy meant that their classrooms had almost as many books as they had to read at home. While many picture books were still expensive, publishers also offered cheaper paper-covered editions of many books, and many adults in North America, much of Europe and elsewhere, generally felt and still feel more obliged to provide children with reading and viewing material. Classrooms and school and public libraries had and still often have an extensive collection of picture books. And like my own three, many children had stacks of them at home. Like many of their peers, my children simply took picture books for granted, like shoes or dinner. For them also, many of the picture books they read represented not a utopian childhood they might aspire to, but more or less the way things were. Their middle-class home was more like the ones they saw depicted in the settings of books like, say, Chris Van Allsburg's Jumanji, or ones by Robert Munsch. Oh, there's one more here. Books like these. Yes, and I think, oh yes, what was it? Now, some years later, their own children have childhoods more like theirs than they're like mine, and including the non-requisite stacks of picture books. So here's some grandchildren reading picture books. All of these books and all of these middle-class households make it very easy to take picture books for granted, to simply assume that they represent a universal experience. But they don't. For one thing, they represent almost exclusively North American or British or Australian norms, English language norms. Nowadays, the North American publishers who produce the books I most readily have access to republish just as few or even fewer books that originate in other countries and other languages as they always have. I'd have to think very hard to name, for instance, even 2 or 3 Japanese picture books that are available in English to English-speaking children. I can remember sharing Tokyo Maruki's Hiroshima no Pika and various books by Mitsumasa Anu with my own children, but that's about all. Furthermore, the picture books that my granddaughters and I have access to still tend to represent the relatively middle-class and white values and lifestyles they share with most of the families represented across the history of picture books. And these are just some recent books that show the focus on white and apparently middle-class kinds of audiences, and especially white, I think. These people are digging a hole, but they're both white. Urban lifestyle, and these ones I found particularly interesting because you can see there are people of color, minority children, in the background. While the Cooperative Children's Book Center at the University of Wisconsin-Madison does not distinguish different kinds of books for young people in its listings of books by and about people of color, it nevertheless reports that in 2014, the 3,500 newly published books it looked at, that's all children's books published by mainstream publishers, I think, in the United States, included only 180 about African Americans, 38 about Native Americans, 172 about Asian Americans, and 66 about Latino children. Figures well below the proportion of minorities in the U.S. population as a whole. The same disproportionate focus on supposedly normal white children holds true in Canada, the UK, and Australia. Among other things, this disproportionate representation means that children from less economically privileged backgrounds or in less fortunate parts of the globe, the ones least likely to have access to the abundant plenty my granddaughters enjoy, are also the ones least likely to see representations of people like themselves. In North America recently, there's been an often heated discussion about white privilege in the publishing industry, as well as elsewhere. The ways in which white editors and publishers concentrate their efforts on books by and about people like themselves. Or, on the other hand, publish inauthentic books centering on minority characters but written by non-minority authors. Even when they do publish books about minorities, they tend sometimes to follow a practice known as whitewashing, downplaying the racial backgrounds of the main characters and the images they choose for cover pictures, as, for instance, for Kelly Armstrong's series about a Native American girl, Julie Kagawa's The Immortal Rules about an Asian girl, or Justine Larbalestier's Liar about a black girl who wears his hair in a natural hairstyle. You can see in this case they, after some public outcry, changed the original cover picture on the left to the one on the right. The publishers who choose these covers claim that ethnic faces limit the sales of their books, all the while insisting on their personal lack of racism. In a recent project I undertook to determine what kinds of picture books most people currently felt comfortable with, I discovered that the large proportion of both the hardcover and softcover picture books on the bestseller lists provided by various newspapers and booksellers in the USA, the UK, and Canada were about animals that talked and acted like human children. Perhaps since we've become more aware of the significance for children of access to representations of people like themselves, this is a way of avoiding depicting the races and the skin colors of completely human children and thus bypassing the issue. Nevertheless, most of these animal characters dressed as mainstream middle-class children live in two-parent families in what look like idealized American British middle-class households and neighborhoods. And so do the humans in best-selling picture books about humans. There are dinosaurs here, but there's also a human being. So. And this one is about a cat, but the humans who own it, and they live in a city that looks like this, surrounded by people who look like this. Oops. If I were working on Words About Pictures now, I'd certainly want to make myself and my readers more conscious of these misrepresentations and absences, and to explore their implications. And I'd also want to look at a wider range of books from different places, and to discuss the extent to which my generalizations about picture book conventions hold across a range of differing national and cultural backgrounds. Does the methodology of Words About Pictures work in the context of picture books for instance, young Japanese readers? Are the conventions universal or based in specific cultural contexts? I don't know. I only know I should know. Unlike me, my children didn't read many comics in their childhood. By the 1970s and 80s, the comics market had changed. They were for sale not merely on the drugstore and bus station magazine racks of my own early years, but in dedicated comic book stores. And the market for them was far more centrally focused on adult collectors than it was on young children, and mostly interested in stories of superheroes. Except for Archie and his friends, the kinds of comics I most enjoyed, the funny ones about people or animals without special powers, had mostly disappeared, or survived only in special editions for nostalgic adult collectors. As I suggested earlier, all that has changed yet again in recent years, with graphic novels using comics formats being produced for increasingly younger readers. At the same time, there are increasing numbers of picture books that mix comic book characteristics with conventional picture book styles. Actually, in this case, this is a novel, but it does include sections just in text and then sections that are like comic books. These texts, produced on paper stocks and in formats that echo those of more conventional picture books, are available for sale wherever picture books are sold. So parents or teachers do not have to feel they're slumming or being weirdly rebellious when they choose to buy them. As Sutton suggests, comics, at least some comics, are respectable now. It's instructive that Cease Bowell's graphic novel El Defo was a runner-up for the 2014 Newbery Medal for Best Book. These pages look like this. And Gillian and Mariko Tamaki's graphic novel, This One Summer, was both runner-up for the American Caldecott Medal and winner of the Canadian Governor-General's Award for Children's Illustration. To me, that seems a little odd. Excellent as they are, the ways in which these graphic novels tell stories is quite different from the techniques of picture books. As I suggested earlier, there are many panels and weird mixtures of words within pictures create different kinds of storytelling rhythms, and therefore different kinds of stories. If I were writing Words About Pictures now, I would be misrepresenting my subject if I didn't include examples of books like these among the texts I discussed. But I'd also need to note the distinction between them and more conventional picture books, to broaden my sense of the variety of ways in which various combinations of pictures and words communicate. While I enjoy reading graphic novels, I can't deny that I still intend to enjoy picture books more. in part, I think, because there's so much less to them. The essential quality of the picture book form is its apparent simplicity. But while a typical picture book contains very little text, only 500 words or so, and just a few pictures, somewhere between, say, 8 and 20, writers and illustrators who understand this form can use it to create miracles of complex storytelling, rich intellectually and aesthetically. And you can see a book as simple as this, which implies way more than it says. Or like this, which is actually quite complicated for a picture book, but surprisingly simple if you compare it to any other kind of literature. Or a book like this, which says more about the relationships of parents and children than many lengthy tomes, I think. Even when they do that, however, they do it in terms of short and relatively straightforward summary of a series of events, albeit sometimes bizarre events, and the visual depiction of just a very few moments chosen out of those events. For me, there's something intensely attractive about that meeting of the simple and the complex, of the simple that implies ever so much more than it seems to just be saying. Picture books are often both much simpler and much richer and more complicated than text for older children, or even for young adults. And while Frisch's Girl in Red, say, is undeniably complex, Gregory's Amber Waiting, which appears much simpler in both style and content, has a way of resonating meaningfully that makes it seem, to me at least, even richer. Even better, I've often shared such books with very young child readers who then revealed a rich awareness of their resonances. Okay, this is a big transition, isn't it? When Words About Pictures came out in 1988, I had been the proud owner of a computer for 4 years. I used it exclusively for word processing. It had a 64K operating memory, and I had to insert a floppy disk, this is for anyone who has never seen these before, containing the operating system into one of its drives, and then the word processing software into the other, in order to create a file that could then be saved on yet another floppy drive disk. Many discs went into and came out of those slots as I worked on my book about picture books. And I felt very tech-savvy and futuristic as I put them in and took them out. I also lost half the book at one point, but that's all right. 2.5 decades later, the world has changed significantly. There are hard drives now, and not to mention cloud technology. The internet exists. So do ebooks. So do book apps. If I were to write Words About Pictures now, it would be foolish of me not to take these new forms into account also. Producers of ebook versions of adult novels seem generally content with providing an electronic duplicate of a book on paper, with nothing much added beyond the ability to change the size of the type and look up the meanings of the words. The people who make ebooks for young readers are nowhere near so resistant to the temptations of technology. If it's possible to make something in the book talk or squeak or jump up and down, then talk or squeak or jump up and down, it does. In Loud Crow's Pop-Out, The Tale of Peter Rabbit, for instance, you can touch and drag objects to make them spring to life or tilt to watch them slide and move. And I can show you what this looks like. Okay, so you can see this is Peter Rabbit, but then he does that. And then the rabbit bunnies go to pick blackberries. I accomplished this by shaking my iPad. Okay. Perhaps the makers of adult ebooks are missing an opportunity. Imagine a version of Romeo and Juliet which enabled readers to pick up the dagger and help Juliet to plunge it into herself. I may be on the verge of a fortune here. Or maybe not. Shakespeare's play would be quite different as a story about how the audience helps the characters to kill themselves. And the ability to enlarge Peter Rabbit's blackberries and then squish them or tilt them into the corner of your iPad makes it for a moment a book about aggression against blackberries. Amidst all this fruit-oriented mayhem and the beautiful classical piano soundtrack, our story seems to get lost. Part of what loses it, I suspect, is that these editions place the app somewhere in no man's land, no longer a book with the sole purpose of telling a story, not quite an animated cartoon with the ability to tell a different kind of story. Some parts of it are animated, while others, often major elements in the plot, just lie there flatly on the screen, suddenly seeming alarmingly inert and insignificant in relation to the other objects busy frolicking around them. Consider, for instance, this app. This is actually the book. A widely acclaimed app based on the beloved picture book Sesame Street's The Monster at the End of This Book, in which the protagonist, lovable, furry old Grover, urges readers to stop turning pages in order to avoid the scary monster awaiting at the end, never realizing, as surely even very young readers with a knowledge of Sesame Street do, that the monster is Grover himself. The creators of the app take advantage of technology by having Grover urge viewers not to touch objects on the screen that might help make the page turn. Objects which, upon being touched, then move in ways that do, in fact, allow the turn. For instance, Grover tells viewers not to untie the knots in the ropes he has wrapped around the pages, meanwhile highlighting the knots in bright yellow. This is him tying up the knots that are going to stick the pages together. It's kind of interesting also to think there aren't actually any pages there to stick together. Meanwhile, where's the highlight picture? I don't see it. Oh yeah, here you can see they get highlighted in bright yellow, so you know where to touch if you're going to not do what Grover told you to do. There's a clear invitation for young readers in on the joke to do just what they're being told not to do and touch the image of the ropes. But what happens when a reader, out of obedience or out of disobedience or stubbornness or sheer mischievousness, chooses to actually do as Grover asks and not turn the page? What happens, I discovered, is more or less nothing. Grover just keeps staring at you, every once in a while repeating his view that it would be terrible if you did turn the page. Well, I guess that would be terrible if you don't turn the page. A viewer's agreement with Grover and consequent refusal to act as the app requires stops its animation and the forward movement of its story dead cold. So this is the best I could do to show this in still pictures. But and that's not. I seem to be reaching the same conclusion about these book apps as I did about comics. That much as I might enjoy some of them, I still prefer picture books. And for a similar reason. I prefer the simple form that allows for ingenious complexity to the complex form that thus far in the short history of book apps, at least, all too often introduces unnecessary complexities just because it can. It's possible, of course, that creators of book apps have not yet realized the potential of this new form of storytelling. It's possible that some thus far undiscovered genius might someday soon come upon a way of telling a story that makes it exactly the right kind of story to tell in this new and different way. Not the kind of story that works best as an animated cartoon or the kind that works best in the form of a video game, and certainly not the kind that works best as a picture book. A different kind of story and a different way of telling it that fully realizes the potential of a new technology. When and if that uniquely book app kind of story comes into existence, when and if it then finds a new body of uniquely book app related storytelling, scholars and others hoping to understand what a book app story is and how it works might find some clues in words about pictures. But those clues will inevitably point them in new directions, a new semiotics specific to a new form of storytelling. If I were writing a book called Words About Pictures a few years from now, I might well be writing about such book apps and not about picture books at all. I suspect, though, that pursuing such a project might best require someone who admires book app storytelling as much as I have enjoyed and continue to enjoy picture books. I plan, therefore, to keep looking at picture books, and I recommend the book app project to anyone keen enough about the subject to pursue it. Someone who may be in this room. Thank you.
We want to do questions?
I'm just wondering about any kind of discussion about the fact or the possibility that a picture with a story can both help one's imagination or curtail it. I'm thinking when I read an older version, the edition of a Dickens novel, for example, and there's these beautiful illustrations, I find myself looking back at them, when I get to a certain part, it's sort of like I want to know what this guy looks like, but yet I read novels without those illustrations, and I have an idea somehow of what I think that this looks like. So I just thought about that. Mm-hmm. Any thought on that?
Well, I would say I think a lot. You have to answer that for yourself, in a sense. In other words, if imagining that those characters in the Dickens novel look like what you're seeing in the illustrations that accompany them is satisfying and shows you something you would never have imagined on your own, then it's adding to your experience. If you feel, there was a whole bunch of really neat stuff I could have seen if I hadn't been misled, then that's a whole other experience. So I would think a lot depends on the quality of the illustrations and then the tastes and interests of an individual viewer.
Let's thank Perry again. I'm going to turn it. I think it's a wonderful, intimate evening. We can keep talking to Perry after when we eat and drink, but I want to turn over. So I have every confidence in you, unlike Perry's Japanese host, that you have tons of brilliant questions. But I want to turn over the floor to Dr. Neil Besner, who's going to say a few words. And Neil Besner is a longtime member of the English department as well, and the current, I always get this, provost and VP academic of the university.
So I was told that I had 54 minutes. Japanese time. Yeah. In March of 1987, I came to the University of Winnipeg in the midst of a blizzard for a job interview in the English department. The interview took place in the chair's office. Among the 5 terrifying interviewers was a grinning, gnomic, and rumpled presence, scribbling furiously in a rumpled notebook, looking up and grinning again, and I knew that I was sunk. What I didn't fully apprehend was that I had just had my first encounter with Perry Nodelman. Over the next, I'm going to give you the abbreviated version, Perry. Over the next 20 plus years, having somewhat but never fully recovered from the trauma of March 1987, I had the privilege of watching and working with Perry in the English department. It was Perry more than any other individual who established the teaching of and research and scholarship on children's literature as a central vocation in the department. It was Perry's work that attracted a succession of other children's literature scholars to the University of Winnipeg. And it was Perry's initiative that first established the University of Winnipeg as a well-known center for this work in Canada and beyond, and that cleared the way for institutions such as Mavis Reimer's Critic and the work done there today. So it's entirely fitting that in 2015, we should be able to honor Perry in his home place, as Mavis might put it. That's just an in-joke, Mavis. I know you get it.
Yes, I do.
You've heard from Mavis how Perry's work has inspired generations of scholars around the world, as it has here at home, so I won't belabor the obvious. Less obvious, maybe, is the vivid existential legacy of Perry's presence in the English department at UW over several decades. I admit that I myself miss the grinning but nonetheless menacing cartoons on Perry's office door, second floor, Ashdown East Side, and the peremptory notes beneath the cartoon advising dilatory children's literature students not to contemplate, not to think of it for a minute, not for a nanosecond, turning in an assignment 4 minutes or 3 minutes late, because the hounds of hell awaited them, or at least the stentorian admonitions of Grover from Sesame Street. To this day, I have not heard the equal of Perry's peerless, ventriloquistic incarnation of Grover. You heard just a couple of words of it, but believe me, ask Perry afterwards and you'll see. I miss the only apparently casual hallway discussions with Perry of literary theory. I miss the light-hearted airiness with which Perry failed to conceal the near murderous seriousness of his commitment, 27 hours out of every 24, to every aspect of his discipline, from classroom to hallway, text to conference to colleague to context, from Winnipeg to the world. I miss Perry waiting silently, ominously, for an essay I promised him on Canadian children's literature and that I was late with. Remember Perry? Yes, I know you do. Grover appeared, furry blue, terrifying in my dreams until I finished it. Perry, thank you for everything you've done and continue to do for those who take children's studies seriously here and everywhere. You are a continuing inspiration to several generations of students and scholars everywhere, as Japan, for one, is about to discover. Thank you for speaking to us this evening, and our very best wishes for many brilliant decades more. Thanks.